Hello, I'm Michael Morton. I'm the clinical director of the Keystone Center Extended Care Unit for Sexual Addiction in Chester, Pennsylvania. The topic that I'd like to present today briefly is the recalcitrant or the non-compliant client. That is the individual who, upon recommendations and prescriptions for care, decides that he or she knows better than the therapist or the people that are trying to help them in their recovery process. What it leaves is a dilemma. It leaves a dilemma for the therapeutic staff, if it's a residential center. It leaves a dilemma for the outpatient therapist, perhaps physician who's attendant, in whether or not that individual will actually do what they say. If they are defiant, or as I use the term recalcitrant, which means they continue to do what hasn't worked in spite of the directives and the prescriptions being given them, it leaves each of us with a problem. And the dilemma is how, in our limited possibilities, authority, and circumstance, are able to influence and somehow facilitate the person's initiation in their own recovery, their own belief in their own self-efficacy, and their readiness, willingness, and ability to apply the recovery tasks. I find over the years, now almost 30 years, that it can be quite frustrating even now when someone who presents with all of the right stuff, so to speak, seems to be ready, seems to be willing, and is above average perhaps intellectually, financially, occupationally, and so forth, and yet seems to continue to be self-destructive. And if I think about that, I have to remember, mostly I have to remember what the addiction and the substances, if that's involved also, are doing for that individual. And what appears to be a perfect life or success and a context that most of us would be envious of sometimes doesn't exhibit the lack that's within, the internal wounds, the scars, the unresolved traumas, and the unresolved or ambivalent relationships that that individual carries within, which are compelling and at times override all of his best interests, as well as those he loves and cares about, in order to experience that brief moment of reprieve or relief from his pain and suffering. And it's a hard task to sit by and watch or witness someone who we perceive to be so talented and capable and competent to self-destruct. What that leaves for the therapist is, in my opinion, a difficult and complicated position in that somehow he or she, if they're competent and have a lot of experience, is able to communicate to the individual in some way, in a compassionate way, that they understand the nature of the addiction and what it does for the individual. I believe that the intervention at that point becomes one's compassionate understanding of the exact nature of what this is doing, not only to the individual but for him, and also the capacity to perhaps enlighten the individual through a demonstration of the discrepancy between that individual's desire, what he would like to be, what he wants to be or strives to be, and what the addictive process is doing to him. That takes patience, takes time, and it takes a certain amount of energy to allow the process to take place. And it doesn't develop in a very healthy way unless there's an initial therapeutic alliance in which trust and some presence of competency on the part of the therapist can be communicated to the client. My own sense of limitation in that is the not knowing, and in addictions in particular, what the individual is dealing with in real life. And as Dr. Patrick Carnes describes in his typologies of the addict, hides how out of control he or she is. I think most of us want to believe that the person's being forthright and honest with us, but the truth is we know, even after years, that we are oftentimes missing certain aspects of the individual. So the behaviors that don't lie are the relapses, or the refusal to go to the meetings, or the decision to determine for himself or herself whether they need group, individual, this kind of therapy, whether they attend that step group or this step group. And the more I hear the defiance or the pushback, the more I begin to think of that as the recalcitrant person. And whatever it is deeply within them that triggers that, whether it's a progressively destructive addictive process which has altered them to the point where they maybe do suffer with competency in being able to make choices, or whether it's the emergence of the medicated trauma, the hidden aspirations on realized in their lives is at some point difficult to ascertain. And so what I think about is the structure, that if the therapist is able to maintain the structure, the safety, the supervision, and apply the basic principles of recovery and what seems to be the ingredients, that becomes the focus, the goal, and the process of that individual's care, that the process is more effective than either I or the client, and that there has to be a surrender to that process, surrender versus even compliance, and that takes time, patience, and a good deal of compassion. Ultimately, I think the frustration that lies within many of us is the frustration that belongs to the client rather than ourselves. And if we're willing to give that back to him or her, it probably becomes a therapeutic opportunity for them to realize within the alliance that it's a problem that they have to deal with, a problem that they can have help with, that we are willing to help them with, but there's these tasks that they have to engage in. So in sum, the complexities of caring for an individual who is disabled in some ways and impaired by an addictive disease or disorder is a task that's quite challenging for even the best of us. The fact that someone who engages in treatment, perhaps even spends a good deal of money for our time or the time of the treatment facility, and then refuses to do what's asked of him, treatment defiance, so that in this therapeutic process, it's actually a goal, a premise that unless one accepts treatment, he or she will not improve or recover. And therefore, part of our job is to address the fact that this person's denial, recalcitrance, or refusal is, in fact, in and of itself, the treatment issue. That leaves us with the dilemma. It also leaves us with tools that are proven and research-based that enable us to keep that person focused on what needs to be. Our own countertransference, our own fears of failure, loss, potential inadequacy need to be acknowledged, need to be remembered in the face and the power of the addictive process. And so we too, just as the client, need to surrender to our own powerlessness in addressing this and rely on what's been tried and true in our process, and also in our understanding of addictive disorder and disease, that we might demonstrate to them and actually be an example of someone who surrenders to a process that is, as far as we know, effective. All right, so once again, I'm Michael Morton, the Clinical Director of the Keystone Extended Care Unit. If you'd like any further information, you can visit our website, keystonecenterecu.net, and also call us, and the number's there on the website, and I'd be happy to speak with you.